Hey guys, it's Sully from Kitchen Table Research, and as I promised, we are going to finish up with John Douglas, who we have mentioned that he coined the term Mindhunters, and he was one of the first criminal profilers in the FBI. And obviously, the show on Netflix, Mindhunters, is based off of John Douglas's work. So let me introduce you to John E. Douglas. He was born in 1945. He's now retired. He was a special agent in the FBI. And as I stated, he was one of the first criminal profilers, and he has definitely written a lot of books and studied a lot of cases. So let's get into some of the cases that he talked about specifically at CrimeCon. One of the cases that he talked about was Donald Harvey. Now, we have not really profiled this type of spree unaliver, so I think it'll be really interesting. So his name is Donald Harvey. He was born in 1952. He's known as a super infamous Smerial person. He claimed to have unalived 87 people, although we know it's confirmed to be at least 37. And John Douglas stated that he believed that he had about 75 victims. So what is an angel of death or a mercy unaliving? That is where somebody believes that they are doing justice by putting people that are already in chronic conditions or in the hospital. They unalive them. They have a different kind of motive and a different type of psychopathy. But he was rehabbed when he was younger. He grew up in Kentucky, and his parents were struggling tobacco farmers and members of the local Baptist church. However, between the ages of 5 to 18, he was SA'd. And he ended up telling his sister only after the SA stopped when he turned 18. So because of that, he dropped out of school. He did earn his GED, and then he was arrested for burglary. So we've talked about this in kind of the McDonald Triad and how people escalate. So Donald Harvey's childhood, he definitely meets the McDonald Triad, and this is what something that John Douglas talked about in his lecture. So he, smortured animals as a child. Now we know that SA leads to bedwetting, so maybe it's not bedwetting as the consequence, and maybe it's really the deeper motive or psychopathy actually comes from the SA itself. And then also he liked to play with fire. So that's the McDonald Triad, which we've talked about several times. And so he was arrested for burglary, which again, we've talked about in escalation. Breaking in and stealing something from somebody is a very private, to break into somebody's home. That is an escalation of somebody's privacy, and that escalation is just going to continue into then them SAing and then them going on to unalive. So we see this very clearly in Donald Harvey's pattern. So then he did enlist in the Air Force, but was discharged only after 9 months due to unaliving attempts and nervous breakdown. And he was also a homosexual, which back in the, I would say he would have been in the 70s at that time. That was just not something that the military accepted, and it was not really widely accepted in the zeitgeist of American culture yet. So he began a job at the Marymount Hospital that was located in Kentucky after he left the Air Force. So within just the first year of him working there, he had unalived at least a dozen people. And John Douglas really talks about this, that it was really hard to pin down this unaliver, because he doesn't have like a clear modus operandi or a way, like a profile in which he does these unalivings. He used different variations, and because these people were already chronically ill in the hospital, it was really hard to tell what could have been a medical issue and what could have been something that Donald Harvey actually intentionally did. Okay, so some of the patients, he would use poisons such as arsenic, cyanide, insulin, which can be used to unalive somebody. Also, covering their faces so they could not breathe, turning off ventilators, and administering fluids that carried infections and diseases. But his kind of claim to fame is that he would insert coat hangers into catheters, and that would be a very, very painful way for somebody to go. It would cause abdominal punctures and peritonitis, which would be an infection of the perineum. So, but he did mostly use cyanide and arsenic, and he would either put them in the food or put them in their IVs. He also worked as an orderly, as an autopsy assistant. So not only was he unaliving these people, but then he was going to their autopsies. You can kind of see how that can be a little bit of a conflict there. So Harvey maintained that he carried out these unalivings because he felt sympathy for the chronically ill patients. However, his actual motive seems to be much more nefarious. And it took them almost 20 years before they discovered the full extent of what Harvey was doing. So in 1987, he goes to the autopsy of John Powell. He had been put on life support after a motorcycle injury. And when they did the autopsy, they found large amounts of cyanide within his system. And so when they did the investigation, Harvey became a person of interest, and he was resigned from the hospital. He also would take body parts and use them for ritualistic manners. And when they closed in on him and took Powell in for questioning, he did actually admit to the unaliving of John Powell, claiming he had euthanized him. However, then the police and other investigators started to think, well, if he's worked in this hospital for 20 years, surely this isn't his first person. So they go on to do some investigation. And it was actually a news anchor that went on to do some of the investigation. And he went and talked to some of the nurses that were at some of these hospitals. He not only worked at the hospital in Kentucky, but worked at another VA hospital. And of course, he worked with patients that weren't really expected to make it. And so, like I said, it becomes quite harder to catch these certain types of people, like a mercy killer or an angel of unaliving, as they're called. So during his investigation, his name was Pat Minarson. He went and interviewed several nurses who stated that they had high suspicions that Harvey was likely a part of several other unalivings. So Harvey did plead guilty, so he got a plea deal to get out of unaliving row, and he pled guilty to 24 counts of first degree. So he was housed at the Toledo Correctional Institute in Toledo, Ohio. And again, he was not executed. However, Harvey did die in March 28th of 2017, and he had been beaten to his unaliving in his cell. So actually, the incident took place on the 28th, and he was unalived on the 30th. And so, again, like John Douglas states, he thinks there's about 75 victims involved with just this one killer, who is Donald Harvey. And we'll pick up next